Hi, everybody. I'm Karen Hartglass. You are listening to It's All About Food. And this is kind of one of my favorite things to do on this program, talk about a specific food or drink. Because as you know, I like to say every food has its story. And today we'll be talking about yerba mate, which has an incredible story, which we're going to learn about from the author of Yerba Mate, a drink that shaped a nation, Julia J.S. Sarreal. And Dr. Sarreal is associate professor at Arizona State University and the author of The Guaraní and Their Missions, a socioeconomic history. She has a Ph.D. in history from Harvard University and teaches Latin American history and Latin American studies. Dr. Sarreal first tried yerba mate as a Peace Corps volunteer in Curuguaty, Paraguay. Her intellectual interest in the beverage soaked while living in Buenos Aires and working on her dissertation about the Guaraní missions. Welcome. May I call you Julia?
Yes, please. Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
Thank you. Well, I was really excited when I first heard from your publisher about your book because I had just had a cup of yerba mate when I got that email. So I'm familiar with the drink or the plant, but there was a lot I didn't know until I read your book. So many questions. I guess the first one is, why did you write this book?
Yes. Well, I'm a trained historian, and I find that history explains a lot of things to me about the way the world works. And I'm a historian of Latin America, and my research is primarily in Argentina, Paraguay, and the Rio de la Plata region more broadly. And so I first tried yerba mate when I was in Paraguay as a Peace Corps volunteer. And I found that you had to drink it in order to talk to people, in order to make relationships. Everybody drank today in the cold form or mate in the hot form, and you, to be part of the community and have a conversation, you had to be drinking it and sharing it with people. So I first drank it there, and it's a very bitter, without sweeteners or other flavors, it's a very bitter drink. If you can think of like coffee without any sugar or anything. So the first time I didn't necessarily like it, but I liked how it brought this sense of community. So I first fell in love with the drink in Paraguay and lived there for over 2 years and drank it a lot. And then I went on to do my PhD studies, and I was working on pretty much a different topic. And my research, though, took me to Buenos Aires because that was the head of the viceroyalty that included Paraguay in the colonial period. So I spent a year living in Buenos Aires, and there I was so shocked. My intellectual interest in yerba mate came about because Buenos Aires has a big cafe culture, and there's cafes on every corner, and everybody drinks coffee, and the coffee is really good. And yet, when you go to the supermarket, you see even more bags of yerba mate, and every corner store kiosk had yerba mate, and you can't drink coffee and yerba mate together because they're both caffeinated substances. It's just too much. So I was very curious about how these two could coexist. And so that brought me into the intellectual research of the project. And originally I was going to do just the colonial period because that's what I was trained as a historian. But whenever I talked to people in Argentina or the United States, they would always say, well, today it's so meaningful to Argentines would say it's so meaningful, it's so important, and tell me their stories about drinking yerba mate. And then when I talk to Americans, they're like, oh yeah, I saw that Guayaquil canned beverage. And then they wanted to hear about the present day. So that's why I took it to a longer story than just the colonial period.
Yeah, well, there's a lot packed in this book. Before we get into any of the history, I also want to talk about yerba mate, the types, how it's made, how it was made, how it is, and all of that, because it's a bit complicated. And when were you in Buenos Aires?
Oh, geez, I've been there. I try to go since COVID, it's been more complicated, but I try to go every other year.
Ah.
I was, my first dissertation research was at 2005, 2006, and then again in 2016, 2017. I lived there for two periods of a year.
Right. And it keeps changing, doesn't it? There's a lot of change that's happening there in Argentina.
Oh, yes. Yes. I love the country.
Yeah. I was only there once in 2010. I think it was 2010. And it was right when gay marriage was approved.
Oh, yeah.
And it was quite something because there were these parades and protests, and there was this one giant penis float. That was unforgettable.
Yes. Yeah. There's been a lot of change in Argentina recently.
So let's talk about the types.
Yeah.
Can we talk about the original kind first? Because that's
Sure.
the most interesting and maybe.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
the scientific name is Ilex paraguarensis. It's comes from the holly family, and it's a tree. Tea is a plant, so it's very different because it's a tree and it's from a different family. But it's a caffeinated substance, just like coffee and tea. And Ilex, again, is the name. Ilex paraguarensis is the only species that's recognized as yerba mate today. But in the colonial period, even into the 19th century and earlier, the indigenous peoples and even the offspring of the Spaniards and the indigenous peoples, they drank different types of ilexes as yerba mate. So they didn't just consider it Ilex paraguarensis. But today we only recognize, and legally it's only Ilex paraguarensis. So there are, in Argentina, they will experiment with some other Ilex. So one company is trying to market a lower caffeinated yerba mate. So they sell Ilex dumosa with yerba mate. So it's a mix of Ilex dumosa, which has less caffeine, and Ilex paraguarensis. And so it has indigenous origins. It began with either the Guarani or the Caingang, which are indigenous peoples of the broader Paraguay, Argentina, Brazil border region. And they drank it, but also it's in some of the colonial sources, it's unclear of all the different ways that they used yerba mate. But today it's drunk and not, I don't know of people consuming it in any other way. Well, I guess people are making flan with yerba mate, and there's a gin that's infused with yerba mate. So there are other ways of using this herbal product, but it's typically drunk.
Okay, so the original way people were drinking it, what I've gotten from your book and through time, the indigenous people that were drinking it, it was a very communal thing. The leaves were put into a container and mixed with boiling water or hot water, and then kind of brewed, and then there's a whole procedure where the thing is the mass is pushed away, and you have the liquid, and then you have a straw that you drink from and pass it around to everyone. And then from time to time you add more water to it. And it's a very communal thing, and it creates a lot of community. But for some of us, it sounds disgusting.
So it's very, very different in the United States versus United States. Also, I would say in Germany and some other places where it's caught on as an energy drink. And the mate or tereré is completely different than any other beverage. So it's not only a caffeinated drink, it's a social practice, as you mentioned. It's communal, it's shared. And when you say to somebody in South America, you don't say, let's go have a coffee. Like you would say, let's have a coffee, one coffee, right? You don't say, let's have a mate. You would say, let's share some mates. So you drink multiple mates, and what you do, it's very different than any other substance. You have a mix of, typically it's a fine powder, some small leaves and some small twigs, and you put that in a recipient. Typically it's a gourd, or today you might have a silicone gourd or a glass gourd. So it's not always the dried vegetable gourd. And you put in, I would say it's about a half a cup of yerba mate, so much more than you would put in
Wow.
of tea or coffee. And you you pour from a thermos, say a quarter cup of water, and then you slurp it out, the drink through this straw. And so it's the straw is called a bombilla. It's metal and it has a sieve at the bottom because you don't want to drink the leaves and the powder. You just want the liquid. And the bombilla is, it's interesting because it's metal and the water is hot. So when you first drink it, not only is it bitter, but it also, the metal straw is hot. And so you have to, you don't gulp it all down in one sip. You kind of take little small sips because you don't want to burn your lips with the metal bombilla. And then you slurp that quarter cup, and then you turn it back to the server, hand back the gourd to the server, and the server refills it from the thermos, refills the water, and passes it to the next person. And it goes around and around around. And it's there are a lot of rules with it, and a lot of it's very much a ceremony. Only the server can touch the bombilla, the straw. Everybody else, nobody can touch the straw other than with their lips. So that's one faux pas that Americans often do. Also, you can't say thank you until you're done completely. So when you drink your sip and you hand it back, you never say thank you, because that means I'm done. So that's kind of also something that takes a lot of time for us Americans to get used to, because usually when you hand something back, you say thank you to alert the person. You cannot do that. And then there's also sayings, for example, you have to drink all of the water from the gourd. You can't turn it back with some of the water still there. And you also need to drink it quickly after they serve it to you. There's different sayings, like, for example, the bombilla or the mate or the bombilla isn't a microphone, because a lot of people might hold it and keep talking in conversation, and that's a faux pas. You have to drink it and then you can keep talking. So it's very different. In the United States, it's mostly this energy drink that you drink from a bottle or a can, and it's it's individual, it's not shared. Very, very different.
Okay, this is fascinating, and this was not in the book.
I'm working right now on an article, hopefully, about the marketing of yerba mate in the United States and how it's different, and why it's different. Like you said, it's kind of disgusting to share a bombilla. We're not accustomed to in the United States, even before COVID, to be drinking from the same glass or using the same utensils. So it's a very different thing.
Okay, I don't know if this has any authenticity or not, but when I was in Buenos Aires, I got this at some tourist shop. And so I'm showing a gourd here, and this is a wooden bombilla.
Yes, a bamboo, taquara.
Bamboo, yeah. But I don't use it because, I don't know how, if I use it, can I clean it? And
so there's you can read a whole process on the internet about how to cure the gourd. And one of the things is you shouldn't leave once you finish with the yerba, you shouldn't leave it for a day on your counter. It'll start to grow fungus and whatever else with the gourd. So
right.
There is more upkeep. I typically just today I'm using my daily mate gourd, which is not fancy. You can see the paint is peeling and it's a metal gourd, but this is my daily. I have a nicer one that I typically use if we had video, I would be using that.
Yes. Okay. I have to go back and get some metal bombillas.
Yeah.
And I'm also surprised to hear the quantities, because a half a cup of yerba mate and a quarter cup of water, that's strong.
Yes. Yes.
And then I imagine as you add more water, it maybe gets weaker. But I've also read that when you continue to add water, it brings more caffeine out into the mixture.
I would disagree with that. Yes, I would disagree with that. Everything I've heard is that the first sips are that have the most caffeine. And when I was living in Argentina, one of the things that I did, I'm not only a historian, but I also enjoy just learning more about yerba mate. So I bought all of the main brands of yerba mate, and I invited my friends over who were Argentine, and I did several of these rounds who drank mate. And so I would serve them tastes of the different brands of mate without telling them which ones were which. And I had to do this after they finished work, so like 5 p.m. And the first sips of mate are definitely the most bitter. They also, if there's any loose powder, but the first sips, you get that powder. So when I was doing the tasting, as being the host, I would do the first drinks of these like 8 different kinds of mate. Boy, I could not sleep the next night because I was drinking the ones with the most caffeine, the first sips of it. But yes, it's really hard to judge the amount of caffeine in mate because you're constantly refilling it, and it depends on how much water you use. Do you use a liter of water? That's a lot of water. And then Argentines typically refill. They say that the yerba is lavado or washed out, and they'll put in new yerba. So it really varies on how much you're drinking. But when you drink it as a tea, so you can buy tea bags of yerba mate, and it is I believe it's less caffeine than black tea. But and as we know, black tea and green tea all have less caffeine than a cup of coffee. But be careful, because when you look at the amounts of caffeine on the different yerba mate beverages that we have in the United States, because a lot of them actually intensify the caffeine content. So they use the yerba mate extract. And I made the mistake one day, because sometimes I'll drink in the afternoon a yerba mate tea with a tea bag. And I decided, well, it's hot here in Arizona. I'll have some, it will remain nameless, of a brand of yerba mate iced tea beverage. And boy, again, I couldn't sleep. And I went and looked at the label, and I saw how much caffeine it had. And it was so much more than a cup of tea. So they vary. The different yerba mate brands vary in their caffeine content.
I don't like tea bags. I'm kind of a purist. I don't like paper or nylon mixing with my tea. And I'm showing you a little mini French press that I use, which I love. It's a Rishi press. And I put my teas in there. It works pretty well. But I'm guessing that maybe my yerba is dilute. Or I don't know. Because I put like a tablespoon in there with a cup, 2 cups max of hot water.
That would be like what they call mate cocido, or the yerba mate tea. So that's different than the mate or the tereré, but people do drink that in South America, mate cocido, made with the much more diluted, like a tea.
Right. But is the mate the same? The actual leaves?
Yeah.
Okay. And I'm just curious, is the cultivated mate different from the wild version?
Yeah. So again, it's the same species. So Ilex paraguarensis is the only recognized legal. If you want to label in South America, if you want to put the label of yerba mate, it has to be Ilex paraguarensis. So there are different types, but you would be breaking the law by using that as yerba mate. But there are different species. And now they're really getting into cloning. The big companies are getting into cloning the yerba mate. So it's becoming even more standardized. And when I was there in 2017 and spent a good amount of time with the yerba production, they were just transitioning to harvesting by machine. So tea for a long time has been harvested by machine. In Argentina is a big tea producer. Most of the tea goes into making our instant tea, tea drinks, the cold tea drinks. It's not considered a high quality tea, but that's you harvest the new shoots on tea. With yerba mate, you want to harvest the mature leaves. So they work really well together. So a lot of the in Argentina, they would coexist tea with yerba mate. So tea has been harvested for a long time there mechanically, and only now are the big producers starting to move from people harvesting the yerba mate to mechanical. So there's going to be a lot of changes there, and a lot of people, without work and land ownership, and it's going to be very interesting about the production of yerba mate into the future.
I really want to get to the history in a moment.
Yeah.
But I have a couple more questions just because I'm curious. So we talk about caffeine, and I've seen a variety of different articles saying that there's caffeine, matine, taine, and I have a chemical engineering background. I want to know the chemistry, and I haven't spent that much time looking into it, but I also haven't found much information saying, is it the same? Is caffeine the same, or is it because there are other things in mate and in tea that interact that we get the different situations?
So I've read about the matine and the all of these different things. It has caffeine. So it is caffeine. It's a different plant. I also, I'm not a biochemist and understand all of this, but it has caffeine. It's interesting, the health benefits and the dangers. There's a lot out there about yerba mate and it being basically a superfood and having all of these health benefits. And that kind of thinking goes back to the very beginning of the colonial period, where it was considered a wonder drug, but then also people concerned about the addiction because it's a caffeine and it's a habit forming. So this idea about the health benefits have been around a long time. There's also talk about it causing throat cancer. But what I've been told is that's because people drinking it too hot. And so you drink a lot, again, with the gourd, and you can, if you're drinking it too hot, it's burning your throat. So there's a lot of information there about health and all of the different nutrients. I enjoy it, and it is definitely a stimulant. But as far as the health benefits, I'm not a scientist as far as that goes.
Well, it does have quite a number of minerals in it, so it does bring a certain amount of nutrition. I haven't drank it in the quantities like you discussed when you were doing the mate sampling, but when I have my cups of mate, I find that I don't feel the same stimulation. It feels nice, but it doesn't feel jittery like coffee caffeine can feel. And I'm not sure if that's caffeine or related to all the other things that come hand in hand in the mate, but it feels good.
Yeah. Or the quantity too.
Or the quantity, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So you span about 500 years in this book of history. And the first thing that's fascinating is, where does that information come from 500 years ago? And how did you find it related to yerba mate? Because with history, we hear about kings and rulers and things, but tea?
Yeah. So I first was exposed to it because I'm trained as a colonialist. So I studied the Guaraní missions in South America. The Guaraní missions were with the Jesuit priests. And basically what happened during the Spanish Empire had a lot of territory. And, we didn't have planes or internet and telephones. And so to rule this vast empire was costly and difficult. And there were a lot of people in the Americas when the Europeans came. And so the Spanish Empire found it beneficial to outsource some of that ruling, we could say. And they got priests, like the Jesuit priests, to set up missions to acculturate the Indians, to teach them monogamy, to teach them to be good Spaniards, monogamy, Catholicism, the Spanish language, settled agriculture, livestock, all of these different things. So they set up these missions, and I was very interested, having been a Peace Corps volunteer and seeing the cultural interactions and the cultural differences in rural Paraguay. I was really interested in this Jesuit Guarani experience. But I was trained as an economic historian, and so I went through all of these accounting records, and the Jesuits and the people who followed them were really good about having accounting records. They kept track of all sorts of things, accounting records, and then also censuses, because they had to pay taxes. The Indians had to pay taxes to the crown because they were, of course, citizens, so they had to pay tribute. Wow. And you had to count the number of inhabitants. And I used that. There's a plethora of information. And what I found in the accounting records were yerba mate, lots of it. So yerba mate, the missions produced yerba mate to sell because it was a popular colonial product. So they sold it and they used that revenue to fund their missions. Also, the indigenous inhabitants, they liked mate, and they forced the Jesuits basically to include that in the daily rations. So they would give meat, and they would also give yerba mate to the inhabitants of the mission. So I kept seeing all of this yerba mate. And as I started to think about yerba mate, I was like, this is really interesting. And Spaniards haven't had, when they came over, they were not exposed to tea or coffee. It was really early. And the first missions were 1609. And so I thought the first Europeans to come to the region would write about yerba mate. And I scoured those sources and they didn't write about it. And I think basically what it was, first of all, they were hungry. They were trying to conquer. They didn't have enough food. Everything was new. And they're just looking for food and trying to survive. And so this strange drink, they weren't interested in it. But the Jesuits were really interested in it, especially because the indigenous people used it in ceremonies. And so I later went into reading about Jesuit accounts of Native society and how yerba mate was in there. The shamans were using it. It was used to talk with according to the Jesuits, to talk with the devil, and it was used in wedding ceremonies, and so on. And so we think that there's, this is hundreds of years ago, and there's not everything is recorded, but there's a lot of information. And I've been fortunate to do my graduate studies at Harvard and was well funded. And was able to spend time in South America and look for sources. And there's a lot out there, and also today online too. So we can read a lot about the past.
When we do read about the past and the future, we see a lot of similar threads. Mm-hmm. So humans like to exploit. Humans like to exploit land, people, animals, even people they're close to. I kind of tend towards being a misanthrope sometimes, because humans can be very ugly. And you see this theme in your book from the beginning. Even the Jesuits that are supposed to be there to do good things, in order to advance their work, they kind of bend it a little. So this yerba mate, it might be connected to the devil, who knows? But, we want to sell it and we want these people to learn our ways. So, okay, we'll give them a little.
Precisely.
Yeah, and that continues throughout. But yerba mate seems to be different than coffees and teas somehow, because it is so connected to culture and community. So as much as the colonists tried to change the people, they could not beat this yerba mate.
And then they try it and they like it, and then they adopt it themselves, and it spreads to Peru, to Bolivia and Chile.
But even still, it never it was never really an explosively trending item that went global.
Yeah. And what I claim is that it really has to do with the structure of the Spanish Empire. So it became very popular in South America, but its transportation costs are high. You know, you drink a lot of this and it's difficult to transport. And for much of the Spanish colonial period, Spain wanted to capture all of the benefits of trade, and they restricted trade and they focused on the mines. There's a lot more money to be made from silver than yerba mate. And so they restricted trade. And so to get this plant from Paraguay to Europe, you had to go from Paraguay, you had to get across the Andes to Lima, and the Andes are quite hard before we had automobiles and trains and such. And then you had to get from Lima to Panama, cross the isthmus, meet up in Cuba and get to Spain. But it was just really prohibitively expensive. And by the time Spain started dismantling these barriers to trade and allowing Buenos Aires to trade directly with Spain, by that time, tea and coffee had really become important in Europe, and it was very difficult for yerba mate to compete. And then very soon thereafter, we have independence wars, and basically tea and coffee are really prevalent. And there were efforts to try to market yerba mate as less expensive, superior to tea and coffee, and it really didn't take off, not until very recently.
Right. Now can you talk about the difference between the leaves, the yerba mate, and the processed yerba mate? Because you talk about them, and you talk about in the earlier times with Argentina and Brazil, the difference between the two and how they were taxed differently and how it affected everything.
Yeah, so today it's very interesting if you buy yerba mate from South America. Today, and there's some of it, different brands and different places have finer grained, founder ground yerba mate. Sometimes like it doesn't have sticks in it, but the most notable difference is the Brazilian yerba mate. So Brazilian yerba mate it's not aged as long, and so it is bright green. It is less processed. And the origins are from when there was a shortage of yerba mate supply, and Argentina worked on technology to accelerate the aging process, whereas and to make it quicker, whereas Brazil eliminate some of the aging process. So today the leaves from Brazil are very green. But the process of harvesting yerba mate is they harvest the leaves and some of the branches, and you toast it. The artisanal way of doing it is toasting it over a fire, like very quickly after you harvest the leaves. You toast it over a fire to it kind of pops, and some of the liquid is removed or dried out of the yerba mate leaves. And then they chop it into smaller pieces, get some of the bigger branches out, and then you toast it. And what I've seen this both the processing, which is more industrialized, and the artisanal way is using what's called the barbacoa, and it's 24 hours under or over a flame. There's a fire, and it's just heated, so you don't burn it, but it's this drying process. And then you take it and you chop it and make it even more fine and let it age for typically 12 months is the standard, but then there's this accelerated process.
Whew, well, aging 12 months can certainly add to the cost.
Yes. So today there's accelerated process. They can do it accelerated, but also that there's been in recent years a premium line of yerba mate in Argentina. So organic, that's aged longer. And so there's some differentiation now in the yerba mate, which that's been relatively probably in the past 10, maybe 20 years at the most.
Yeah, I'm wondering about the drying process or the process that exposes the yerba mate to some burning material. And in my very short, quick reading on the pluses and minuses of yerba mate, there was a mention that maybe the increased cancer risk has to do with the materials that are used to dry and toast.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if different companies are using different methods there.
There's this wide range between really kind of scientific, industrialized, really advanced machinery companies, and then there's these smaller companies that do more artisanal, organic. But the market, I know mostly Argentina is dominated by these really big producers. And so, yes, you do have variations, and there's some regional differences where some people like the smoky flavor, and so there is like this barbacoa flavor where it has more of a smoky flavor, but that's again kind of a specialty market. So there are differences in different tastes for yerba mate.
And I imagine that the greener Brazilian variety tastes a little different.
Yes. And the people that I know who get it here, they store it in their freezer to keep it fresh. So yeah, it's a different.
The Brazilian variety.
Yes.
Okay. Noted. I wouldn't even know where to get it. Do we have
it's much harder. It's much harder to get. So what's interesting is when I first moved to Arizona, I had lived in California before, and I could readily get yerba mate at Latino stores in the San Francisco area. It was not a problem. And I moved here to Phoenix. This was in 2009. And I was like, where am I going to get my yerba mate? And the first place I got it was at Haji Baba, a Middle Eastern supermarket, because the second largest importing country of yerba mate is Syria. Uruguay does not produce yerba mate. They're the largest importer, and then Syria. So there are a lot of people in the Middle East who drink yerba mate. So that's where I first got it. And then I found Tienda Latina that sells an assortment. Mostly it's Argentine brands. I've gotten them to carry now some Paraguayan, and they do carry some Brazilian and Uruguayan too.
Well, I haven't looked outside of Whole Foods and Trader Joe's and the regular supermarkets, but I live in New York City and we have everything. Yes. So I bet I could find it.
I'm sure you can.
Look. Okay, another ongoing theme over the 500 years were the poor indigenous folks that were drinking and were growing the yerba mate and were drinking it, and it was part of their livelihood. And sometimes when there was limited funds, limited budget for food, yerba mate wasn't like the second or top ingredient of the list.
Yeah,
which is curious, but I like to think that because there are some nutrients in yerba mate that it helps sustain them, not just stimulate them. But interesting the way other people perceive these people over time, either as yerba mate was healthy and invigorating or made them lazy.
Yes.
That seemed to go back and forth over time.
And isn't it ironic? I think it's so funny that people would think that a caffeinated substance makes somebody lazy. But it was the thought that you sit around in this round and drink mate, that you're wasting time. But it exposes the classism, especially in Argentina. This was a difference from the other parts of like in Uruguay and Paraguay, southern Brazil. People continued to drink yerba mate, have always drunk yerba mate. Whereas in Argentina, in the 20th century, especially late 19th century, there was a classist kind of opposition to yerba mate. It was anti-hygienic because you share the bombilla, but Argentines, especially elite Buenos Aires, in elite class in Buenos Aires, they wanted to be more European, wanted to be more modern, and they saw mate as something antiquated, and they associated it with the countryside. It was interesting. It's been interesting is that in Argentina, there's this vague notion that yes, it originated with indigenous peoples, but when you think about the history of mate, it's been in Argentina, people associate it more with the gauchos or the cowboy, the rural folks. And so when Argentina wanted to aspire, and in the early 20th century, it was one of the top wealthiest countries in the world, one of the top 10 wealthiest countries in the world, they wanted to be more European, drink tea, drink coffee, not this strange mate. And so it became a clandestine beverage of the elite, and they looked at it as something that the poor did, something that people would subsist on mate and some crackers, and that's what they could live on. And mate is a stimulant. It is addictive. And so people prioritized it. It has always been considered a basic necessity. So when Argentina, from the beginning, when the government came up with a list of the basic necessities, yerba mate has always been on that list. And there's been the sense, though, in the early 20th century, was that as Argentina became wealthier, people would stop drinking mate. They'd turn to coffee and tea. And clearly, especially in the past 20 years, that has absolutely not happened. There's been a renaissance of mate, and people, Argentines especially, embrace mate now. And it's definitely not, if anyone says that you're lower class, and it's been said that mate is associated with the lower class, there's immediate repercussions, and it becomes a big scandal. A couple of years back, there was La Cheta, or the snob of Nordelta. She was heard in an audio recording complaining to her real estate agent about the condo that she had bought in Nordelta, which is outside of Buenos Aires. It's kind of a bedroom community. People have weekend homes there. She bought a condo and spent a lot of money, and she's just a normal woman, surgeon, but a normal woman. And her neighbors would drink mate by the pool like it was a lower class beach resort. And she wanted it to stop, or she wanted her money back. And this went viral. It was even published in the New York Times.
Yeah, I think I remember this story.
And some people do think that way. And there's been, again, with COVID, another congressman who said, maybe this is a great opportunity to get rid of this horrible practice that's responsible for the decline of Argentina. And then he said he was joking, that wasn't really true. But there are these, every once in a while, these classist statements about mate, and then the whole society comes back and says, that's horrible. So there's these undercurrents that still exist.
That's something we see a lot of in the United States, this belief that bigger is better. Corporations seem to get more government benefits than small businesses and people that want to grow their business. The bigger corporations have lobbyists and more power, mm-hmm. and they have the ear of the politicians. And you read that in your book about mm-hmm. the poor folks that have been growing the yerba, and they want assistance, they want help, they want access to processing. Mm-hmm. And over the hundreds of years, there's been a variety of things that happen, taxes on imports mm-hmm. and exports, but somehow the bigger folks always seem to win.
Well, yes and no. Yes and no. In Argentina, there are, and there have been throughout the 20th century, about seven big yerba mate companies that are the processors. And the number, which companies are within the seven has changed over time, but there has always been about seven. And they're very dominant. But there has been, there are still a number of medium and small growers of yerba mate. My concern, especially, is now as the harvesting is becoming automated and you need big machinery to harvest, it's going to be even more centralization. But there's been ups and downs, but there have been a number of small and medium producers of yerba mate in Argentina, which has been it's been a struggle. But it's a very interesting history because where it's grown is in the borderlands of Brazil and Paraguay, where there's indigenous peoples. Guarani is frequently spoken. Population tends to be darker, mestizo, mulatto, and yet the growers of yerba mate, they are a lot of them have roots and call themselves as colonos, and they have roots from Europe. And it's very strong still, the Ukrainian, the Polish identities of these different communities where yerba mate is grown. So there's still class issues where a lot of the pickers are more mixed race, whereas the growers, the small farmers, are these colonos, people who are blonde and white, often with these European roots. So it's a fascinating, to me, it's been fascinating, not only the customs around drinking mate and the perceptions about drinking mate, but also the growing and it's out in the borderlands where much of Argentina focuses on Buenos Aires in the center. This takes us out to these borderland regions.
Speaking of race, I'm remembering in the book, I think it was late 19th century, early 20th century, a few journalists were trying to write about the plight of workers and their difficulties and called them white slaves.
White slaves.
And they weren't really white. And I found that really curious because you talked about how the people in power, the white people, it affected them because hearing about white slaves was upsetting as opposed to non-white slaves. But I was also wondering, were the journalists doing it to promote themselves somehow, get more attention, or were they, or maybe a combination, or were they really genuine in their reporting?
It's to attract attention to the issue, to their articles, and therefore also themselves. But it was noteworthy that this was in 1908 was when it really started, this idea of drawing attention to the exploitation of the yerba workers. And in Paraguay, there was an author, a Spanish author named Barret, and he wrote about esclavos, slaves, but he never called them white. But the author Bouvier, who was French and was writing about Argentina and also the whole borderlands, he called them white slaves, when clearly, they're Guarani speakers, they're from this region, they're darker skinned, there's Brazilians, they're not white. And he even says, no European could ever do this work. But he's calling them white to draw this attention to the issue, because again, it would be, if we exploit indigenous peoples or people of African ancestry, that's, of course that's bad, but it's not that bad because they're not white, they're not European. And so this really drew attention to it. And it's ironic because Argentina has a long history of identifying itself as a white nation, and saying that we're all offsprings of Spaniards, primarily Spaniards and Italians, with a mix of some Germans in there and other races, but we killed off all of our indigenous population and we don't have any blacks. And there's a long history of that kind of idea, perception. And it's true that there are that if you look at the phenotype of people in Buenos Aires, there tends to be more of a whiter population. But they definitely did not kill off all of the indigenous or African people of African ancestry. So it's interesting how this rhetoric of white slaves fits into that narrative of a white nation, even though that's not really true. But that whole history is definitely exists.
Yep, it's all part of the fascinating story in Yerba Mate, the drink that shaped the nation. So just in the last few minutes, let's talk about Yerba Mate today
Mhm.
in Argentina, but also here in the United States. What's happening with it and how did it become popular again?
Yeah. So I argue that the renaissance of yerba mate in Argentina really came about because of the unfortunate repeated economic crises in the country. So because yerba mate has been associated with the lower class and workers, and there's been a lot of political pressure to keep it inexpensive. And so for the government to institute price ceilings, or subsidies or other things to keep yerba mate inexpensive for the workers and for the poor. So we had repeated crises for much of the 20th century, but it really became bad in the 1980s and 90s. And sociologists write about the loss of the middle class, the new poor. So people who were factory workers losing their job, people who were middle class losing their income, and there's high inflation. And so what do you do when you have less money? You look for ways to economize. And so these new poor and people with cuts in their income, they're looking for ways to replace, to substitute. So, instead of taking a taxi, you take the bus. Instead of driving, you ride your bike. Instead of drinking coffee, drink maybe yerba mate tea or mate. People started replacing tea and coffee with yerba mate. Also, another benefit was Argentina. One thing I love about Argentina is how welcoming people are, and how important meals are, sharing meals and having a long, drawn out meal with lots of conversation, be that at lunch or dinner, or to go to somebody's house for an asado on a weekend for grilled meat. And a meal lasts for hours, and lots of conversation and sharing, and you never feel rushed to end. Well, again, as you have cuts in your budget, buying meat is expensive, but having meals is expensive. But you can have that same sociability with mate. So you invite somebody over to have unos mates or some mates, and you're still sharing food, and maybe you add some cookies or something less expensive. So people were being more exposed to mate because they had to cut their budget, but then they were also developing an appreciation for it. Furthermore, in the era of globalization and all of these difficult crises, Argentina and Argentina was going through in the 80s a return to democracy. There was a desire to have some pride and some sense of hope. And so embracing a drink that is, I love the word autochthonous, or native to the region, that's something that's theirs, was really appealing. So to say that this mate is ours, it's very different than your Coca-Cola or coffee or something. It's ours. And so that led to this resurgence of yerba mate. So it is now the national infusion of Argentina. And Argentina also has made yerba mate Argentina indicator of geographic origin, just like tequila is Mexican and champagne is French. That's a little touchy because Paraguay and Brazil also produce yerba mate. But there's this sense of this identity, but it also goes across borders, that it is something of that region, not just of Argentina. Oh, and I should say about yerba mate today, that if you read newspapers, college newspapers, there's often lots of articles about yerba mate infiltrating college campuses, and especially in California and Colorado, in artistic communities, and yerba mate is thought of as this healthy energy drink in the United States, and it's also a big party drink in Germany. where they mix it with alcohol, club mate, and it's a favorite of hackers and club goers in Germany. And there are also other little iterations of yerba mate, which I'm researching right now. So we'll see what the future is. There's a number of brands in the United States that are coming out. A lot of them are associating with causes, that a portion of their profits are being donated to certain causes. Also that they are organic and that they're trying to do fair trade and help the farmers that grow it. So that's all very promising.
Well, Julia J.S. Sarreal, the author of Yerba Mate, the drink that shaped a nation. I really enjoyed talking to you today and learning so much about yerba mate. It's been a pleasure.
It's been fun. I really enjoy it. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And so ends another episode of It's All About Food. Thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed that interview. I know I enjoyed reading Yerba Mate, the drink that shaped a nation, and speaking with Julia J.S. Sarreal. I love learning about this tea, and I'm going to be enjoying drinking it a lot more, knowing its story. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm Karen Hartglass. You've been listening to It's All About Food. Comments and questions can be sent to me at info@realmeals.org. Everybody have a delicious week. Bye-bye.